Okay, so in this lesson, what we're going to focus on is another important English settlement up north in the New England colonies, and that is the settlement of Plymouth. All right, now before we get into Plymouth, I just want to review a couple things with you. Hopefully, these images will be familiar to you, and hopefully, you'll be able to associate them with Plymouth. Okay, so question number one: who are these people? Correct. They are pilgrims. Okay. They are pilgrims. What was the Mayflower? Right. It was the ship that the pilgrims came over on when they left England to come to the New World. And then what is shown on this map? You have Connecticut, Rhode Island, Massachusetts, New Hampshire. You're correct. These are our New England colonies. Okay. So hopefully these images will help you associate what we're going to talk about with Plymouth. Now, again, these notes you have to do on your own. There's no worksheet or anything like that. So please be sure you're jotting them down as we go through. And this time, because the Pilgrims were Puritans and Puritans wanted to purify the church, the acronym that we're going to be using is the word pure. Okay. Now, we got to get into a little bit of world history here with the Puritans and the word pure and stuff like that. In fact, P stands for Purify the Church of England. Okay. Now, you have to go back in English history to Henry VIII and the English Reformation. Henry VIII, if you remember, wanted a divorce. Okay. His first wife would not provide him with a male heir. He got frustrated about that. So he wanted a divorce, and the Pope, who was head of the Catholic Church, and at the time Henry was Catholic, the Pope said, no, you can't divorce your wife because of that. And Henry said, well, I'm going to form my own church, and I will be in charge. And of course, that is the Church of England. And as soon as Henry forms his own church, he's in charge, and he gets his divorce. Okay? So you have a new Protestant church, the Church of England. Now, the problem for some people with the Church of England is it was a lot like the Catholic Church. It was organized a lot like the Catholic Church, except instead of the Pope in charge, you had the monarch in charge. And there were a group, the Puritans, that said, look, our Church of England, if it is a true Protestant church, it should not look anything like a Catholic church. It should not have the same style of worship. It should not have the same ornamentation in the churches. Okay. If we're going to separate, we need to have a complete separation. And not everybody agreed with that. Okay. There were several people in England that said, actually, no, we kind of like the Church of England the way it is. We're okay with the way it looks, except we don't have a pope, and that's fine with us. So the Puritans began to be persecuted because they kept saying, look, if we're going to split, we need a complete split. And they end up going around Europe. They kind of leave England and they go up to other countries around Europe. And eventually they decide they're going to come over to the New World. And eventually they head over to Massachusetts. Okay. Now, this is a big difference between Jamestown and Plymouth. Jamestown was a business colony. Plymouth is a religious colony. The Puritans, of which the Pilgrims were a group, the Puritans were looking for religious freedom. Okay. And Plymouth gets founded in 1620 in what is today Massachusetts. Now, a little interesting story about this, and I heard this from one of those weird. It was in one of these weird history books or unknown stories of U.S. history. The Pilgrims were actually headed to Jamestown, okay, but their ship got blown off course and ends up closer to the coast of Massachusetts. And you had the Pilgrims on board the Mayflower, but you also had the crew of the Mayflower. And the crew of the Mayflower was not necessarily pilgrims. In fact, the pilgrims kind of annoyed the crew of the Mayflower because they were very, very religious, and the crew was not. So the crew was able to kind of deal with things because they had beer. on board. But by the time they get close to the shores of Massachusetts, the beer is running low. The crew decides they really don't want to take the time to get the Pilgrims down to Jamestown. So the crew basically says, hey, we're here. There's land. We're close enough. There you go. Okay. So the Pilgrims disembark, and that's how they end up at Plymouth, and that's how they end up in Massachusetts. Okay. Now, before they leave the boat, they form a government. The U in P.U.R.E stands for United by the Mayflower Compact. Okay. Now, the Mayflower Compact established a covenant community. Okay. A covenant is an agreement. It is often referred to as a biblical term. Okay. We think of it in terms of the Bible. God made a covenant with Abraham. Okay. It's a binding agreement. And if either side breaks the covenant, bad stuff is going to happen to them. Okay. In fact, in the Bible, there's this image. God has Abraham walk down this path between these animals that have been torn apart. And God says, if I break this covenant, may this happen to me. Okay. And there's and that's the idea of how serious the covenant is. Okay. Is if one side breaks it, may death happen to them. I mean, that's basically how serious a covenant is. So it's called the Mayflower Compact because they sign it on the Mayflower. They agree to base their government, okay, on their religion. Okay, religion comes to dominate New England life. All right, so they agree to use their religious beliefs as a basis for their government. White land owning men signed it, no women. Okay, even though women were on board the Mayflower, it was not signed by women. It is a source that we went to when we formed our Constitution, okay, because it was a form of law. Okay, so the idea behind it and the idea that everybody on board is going to agree to it, we use that later when we get to the Constitution. Okay, and it was signed November the 21st, 1620. All right, and it also gives a very limited form of self government to the Pilgrims in Plymouth. All right. So this is their government under the Mayflower Compact. Now, we talked about this last week. The R stands for ran off dissenters, people who disagreed with the Puritans. Okay, we talked about this. You had these other groups that were coming over to Massachusetts looking for the same thing. They were looking for religious freedom, they were looking for religious tolerance, and yet they disagreed with the Pilgrims, they disagreed with the Puritans, and the Pilgrims and Puritans, instead of granting them tolerance and freedom, which is what they were here for to begin with, they end up running these dissenters off to Rhode Island. Okay, now two of the big names are Roger Williams and Anne Hutchinson. Okay, and I want to talk a little bit about Roger Williams and Anne Hutchinson here and talk about, okay, so when we say they dissented, they disagreed with the Puritans, what exactly were they disagreeing about? Okay, well, Anne and Roger both thought that Massachusetts had not done enough to break away from the Anglican ways. Okay, once again, you had the Puritans who wanted to break away from the Church of England, the Anglican Church, because they said they haven't done enough to break away from the Catholic Church. And now Roger Williams and Anne Hutchinson say, you have not done enough to break away from the Church of England, from the Anglican Church. Okay, so that was the number one thing, is both of them thought, you Puritans have not done enough to break away from England, from the Church of England. Now, Roger Williams was first. Okay, Roger Williams was first. He had interesting ideas. Like, for example, he said settlers had no right to take Indian land. Okay, that the English should at least pay the Indians for their land, Okay, but they definitely should not take it away. And because of these ideas, the fact that he was upset that they hadn't done enough to break away from the Church of England, and because he was walking around talking about this crazy notion that we shouldn't take Indian land, he gets kicked out first and he goes to Rhode Island. And in Rhode Island, he says, okay, look, we are going to have true religious freedom here for everybody. This idea of a covenant community is not working. So we're going to have separation of church and state. It's not that he was rejecting religion. It's not that he was rejecting his Christian religion. He just said maybe religion should not dictate what goes on in the government. In the government. Okay, so he advocated for a separation of church and state, and he broadened the idea of who could participate in government. It wasn't just land owning males, and it wasn't just land owning males who belonged to the church, because in Massachusetts that was the key. You had to own land and you had to belong to the church. Roger Williams said, as long as you are a male and you are the head of a household, you can vote in Rhode Island. Okay? It doesn't matter how much property you own, doesn't matter which church you belong to. Okay? And to be honest with you, I think he would go on and say basically all males can vote in Rhode Island. Again, sorry, women, you can't vote yet. Okay, we're just talking about men. But he is broadening the number of men that can vote. Okay, you don't just have to be a member of the church. You don't just have to own property. Okay, all males could vote. Okay. Now, Anne Hutchinson comes several years later. Okay. Anne Hutchinson also believed that not enough had been done to break away from the Church of England, Anglican Church. She also began to preach that salvation was by God's grace alone. Okay, there was nothing you could do to earn salvation. Now, there was nothing in that offended the Puritans, okay, or the Pilgrims. If you ask a Puritan or a Pilgrim what they believe saved you, they would say that, okay, God's grace alone. What bothered them was the fact she was a woman. Okay, so she preached salvation by God's grace alone, but the fact that she was a woman preaching it, that's what caused the problem. Okay, and they had warned her several times that she needed to stop preaching, and she stopped for a while, and then she picked it back up. And they said, okay, we've had enough. You need to go to Rhode Island. And she goes to Rhode Island. Then sadly, she basically ticks some people off in Rhode Island too. Okay, and keep in mind, Rhode Island was supposed to be this colony for freedom and tolerance. I mean, that's what Roger Williams wanted. And she eventually ticks some people off in Rhode Island, and she gets kicked out of Rhode Island as well. And she is going to end up in New Netherland. Okay, now New Netherland is going to become New York. Okay, so she ends up in New Netherland. Of course, New Netherland has a border with Canada. And she begins to minister to the Indians in New Netherland. And she also ticks off the Indians. Okay. And the last that we hear of Anne Hutchinson is she's out in the wilderness, and she ends up getting killed. She's killed by Native Americans. And the reason they kill her is because of her ideas. She is shaking up traditional Native American ways of life in terms of what women should do and what women should not do, and this, this idea again, this idea of salvation by faith alone. The Christian religion, I think, is shaking up some Native Americans. So she ends up getting killed by Native Americans, and that's the last that we hear of Anne Hutchinson. And she had something like, gosh, she had more than 10 kids, I think. I mean, really, she had an extraordinary family. She and her husband had numerous children. So kind of sad the way she ends. She's never really accepted anywhere, and she ends up getting killed by Native Americans. So very, very sad end to Anne Hutchinson. Now, here's our little map here. You see the Puritans, the Pilgrims come to Plymouth in Massachusetts. That's where they settle in 1620. Here is Rhode Island, which is where the dissenters go. And of course, this map, New Hampshire, Massachusetts, Rhode Island, Connecticut, all of them make up our New England colonies. Okay, so here are our New England settlements from 1620 to 1636. Okay. Now the R, oh, I'm sorry, the E, we're already at E, I'm sorry. E, established the first permanent settlement in New England, okay? Jamestown is the first permanent English settlement, period. It is the first permanent English settlement in the South. Plymouth is going to be the first permanent English settlement in New England. Okay, so that's kind of why we talk about Plymouth. Also, because of the religious connections, the Mayflower Compact, the fact that they're over here for religious freedom, not to make money, etc., that sort of stuff. That's kind of why we focus on Plymouth. Now, the last thing we want to do is I want to do a couple of cause and effect charts. Okay. We're going to start, and this kind of summarizes the history of this area. Plymouth would not have been founded if the Puritans had not been persecuted by the Church of England. Okay, because the Puritans were persecuted by the Church of England, that's why they leave England and come here to the New World. Okay, in Plymouth, Massachusetts. So that's why Plymouth is here, is because the Puritans were being persecuted back home. They end up coming to the New World and settling in Plymouth. Now, keep that in mind because we're going to talk about Roger Williams and Anne Hutchinson. Roger Williams and Anne Hutchinson began speaking out against the Puritans in Massachusetts. Again, they are looking for freedom and tolerance, which is what they thought the Pilgrims and the Puritans were looking for. But the Pilgrims and the Puritans say, no, we can't stand it. So they get banished and they have to leave the colony of Plymouth. And of course, they end up going and forming Rhode Island. And Rhode Island becomes that colony for dissenters. Okay? So I just wanted you to see persecution leads to the founding of two important colonies in New England. The Puritans were being persecuted by the Church of England, so they get kicked out and they come to Plymouth, they come to Massachusetts. Then they themselves are not willing to tolerate dissenters like Roger Williams and Anne Hutchinson, and they kick them out of Massachusetts. They go, Roger Williams goes first, Anne Hutchinson comes later. They get banished, and they end up forming the colony of Rhode Island. Okay? So both Rhode Island and Massachusetts are founded because of persecution and for a desire for increased tolerance and freedom. Now, that wraps it up for our two key settlements, okay? We talked about Jamestown in the south, and we're going to talk about Plymouth here, okay, up in New England in the north. Next week, what we're going to do is we're going to wrap up our talk about exploration and colonization, and we will probably get ready for our first major test coming up next week.